Final Dreams of a Filly. Chapter 1. The moon was chillingly beautiful. The young filly watched it silently, a rare moment of reverence for her normally exuberant personality. A chill ran through her tiny frame, and she pulled the thin material closer round her fledgling wings, trying to trap her frail body beneath the scarlet cape, the emblem. A smile poured at the corner of her mouth as her lavender eyes caught sight of insignia. The symbol glittered in the moonlight, tendrils of frost having begun to collect on the surface of the cape. Winter was coming, and soon. Her eyes fell away from the frost as she dismissed it. So what if it was cold? The filly nestled closer betwixt the wooden beams of her residence, and closed her eyes tight in defiance. There was no time to worry about that now. Now it was time to sleep. Every filly knew the moon meant that, and ever she didn't have the energy to fight its silent nocturne. "Good night, Mom. Good night, Dad. I love you," she called out softly. The answer was the same every night. Silence, only broken by the creaking of the aged structure, warping with the change of the seasons. The eerie creaks of the empty room would have frightened most, but this was her clubhouse, unknown to her two best friends. It had also been her home for several months now. Scootaloo curled into herself, and tried to will herself to sleep before the cold could set in, and keep her awake. Fitful hours passed before she hastily lapsed into unconsciousness, took her trembling body, and with a final exhale, the steam rising from her mouth, she fell asleep. Sunrise brought with it a new world. The tiny frost crystals had seemingly taken seed and overtaken the landscape. It was as if the world had been waiting too long for too little, and suddenly allowed its need to flood the earth with a bone-chilling cold. Down cascaded through the foliage, surrounded the small structure, the gentle rays illuminating everything but the tiny huddled figure in the furthest corner of its shelter. As early as it was, she would not expect anybody to be out looking for her. The gentle nudge that slowly brought her to consciousness came as a shock, and she started as her eyes snapped open and rose to meet the gaze of the mare looming over her. A yell broke forth from her as she tried to push herself to her feet and clambered back away from the stranger. "What the hey? Who are you?" she cried, eyes widening as the adult took a step closer. As the surprise wore off, her tone turned to annoyance as she took note. The sun had not even barely risen yet, though the clubhouse window. "What the hey, lady? Why'd you wake me up? The sun isn't even all the way up yet." Only then, taking back control of her situation, did the filly take a good look at the stranger. The mare looked like an alicorn, old and worn far past even what Celestia looked like. Her pelt had faded drastically, though age had a dull luster of muted gray to it. Her wings hung low at her sides now, the feathers thin and barren, only soft down clinging to them. Her mane shone no stars of Celestia's decadence, but draped around her like a white cowl, solemn and straight. What took Scootaloo back the most was the horn. It had been snapped in two, with a thin hairline crack running through it. They all They all fell to a point just above her eyes, the saddest brown eyes that Scootaloo had ever seen, that had fixated down upon her. Meeting those eyes caused a lump to rise in her throat, and she struggled to swallow it before wrenching her gaze away and casting a sidelong glance to the Alicorn. Who who are you? And why'd you wake me up? The mare stood silent for a few moments more before she closed her eyes and bowed her head, shaking it slowly. Scootaloo, I'm so sorry. How'd but how'd you know my name? Mare winced at the outburst before stomping her hoof resolutely to silence the filly and continue. Sorry, sweetie. I didn't wake you. You never woke up this morning. The tension in the air almost made her choke on the lump. Tears stung her eyes as she shook her head and took another step back. You're lying, she whispered, her voice unintentionally harsh as she continued to back away. It was then her hoof hit something solid. She expected the sound of it meeting wood, but it only made a dull thud as it collided with the object. Slowly she turned her head to see what it was. She felt ill as her heart fell deep into her stomach, and she started transfixed at the tiny bundle that lay there. It was wrapped in her cape. Its vague visage was made by the violet tendrils of its mane. It was her, and it wasn't breathing anymore. Final Dreams of a Filly, Chapter 2. Scootaloo stared down at herself silently. Regret flooded her as though as flooded her as thoroughly as though as the tears slid down her face. There's so much I was gonna do. I never felt my special talent in life. And then my cutie mark. I never thought it would end like this. Apple Bloom, Sweetie Belle, and I were all gonna do it together. This is a nightmare. The thought quented her. This was a nightmare, and that was all it could be. She rounded on the mare, eyes narrowed. This is messed up. You know that? What gives you the right? Why? It had been countless centuries of the same question. The mare closed her eyes and thought for a moment, wondering how she still never quite had a good answer. After a moment her eyes opened and extended one of her wings, as if to beckon the filly near. I wish I had a better answer, but this isn't a nightmare, Scootaloo. You fell asleep, and the temperature dropped so suddenly there was nothing any plane could have done. As she spoke, she slowly came closer, the heartache in her eyes deepening as countless times before the filly began to beg. No! She screeched, rearing and striking the mare with her front hoofs. No! Please! Please, I'll do anything you want. I'll never break any Rarity's floor models. I'll never sneak cupcakes from Sugar Cube Corner. I'll even go back to the orphanage. Please. The momentum in her voice wound into sobs as she felt her front legs collide with the old man's body. The mare didn't cry out in pain or try and defend herself. What she did was much worse, and Scootaloo broke into fresh sobs as the mare tucked her wing over her broken body and lowered her head to gently nuzzle her muzzle. I'll do anything. Please. I don't want to die. Quiet dominated the small room. The only sounds were that of Scootaloo quietly crying into the coat of the mare. Occasionally The mirror would softly shh or soothe her, but otherwise said nothing. The filly was right in that it was not fair to have lived alone for so long, and to perish alone, without purpose to life, was cruel. It was also why she was here. It was a long time before Schuyler found her voice again. Turning to look at her body, she addressed the mare. What happens now? She turns her gaze up at the ancient Alicorn and tried to quell the tremor in her voice. Am I going to hell? I never found my special purpose. I never did anything with my life. Last thing I did was. She bit her lip and took a moment to collect herself again, fresh tears breaking. I told Apple Bloom I was gonna be the first to find it, and we got in an argument. That was the last thing I that was the last thing I ever said to one of my best friends. Scootaloo. The filly looked up at the mare, but it hadn't been that she that had spoken. Her eyes widened as sickening realization sunk in, and she turned to face the door. Apple Bloom, Apple Bloom, I mean, Apple Bloom stood there, and she could hear Sweetie Belle following not far behind. That had only just bounded in, and hadn't spotted her yet, but the yellow filly persisted, unaware of what had happened. Scootaloo, you sleepy slowpoke! Did you forget about the meeting today? Sweetie Belle squeezed in, and shot Apple Bloom a reproaching look before looking around the room. It was still only just morning, but finally she found her friend in the corner. There you are! Why are you still sleeping? That's unusual for you, Scoot. And usually you're the first one up. Apple Bloom rolled her eyes and smiled. Guess I'm gonna be the first to get my cutie mark then, huh, Scootaloo? She tossed her scarlet mane and grinned wider, and approached her still sleeping friend. But seriously, you gotta get up now, Only once she got close did she go quiet. That was enough to worry Sweetie Belle. Neither of her friends were ever this quiet normally. Apple Bloom? She queried, taking a step toward her. Her friends didn't say any word, but sank to our hunches, eyes still transfixed on Scootaloo. The beginnings of panic started to sink in, but she forced herself to move to her friend's sleeping form, gently placed a hoof on it. Scootaloo, it's time to get up. Ice met her touch. The velvety coat was now rigid and cold, and her frame hard from the onset of rigor mortis. Scootaloo, this isn't funny. Scootaloo, please get up. Wake up! Wake up, please! Her voice rose in volume and pitch as she began to shake her friend, screaming louder and louder to arouse deaf ears that could not hear her. Finally, there were no words, just a wordless wail of horror and grief as she began to choke on her own tears. Then pain. Pain erupted in her jaw, and she reeled, stunning into silence. Apple Bloom stood over her, tears streaming down her face as she fought to regulate her breathing. She looked up at her silently, but the question was almost audible in her face. Why? Apple Bloom took a deep breath before helping her to her feet and gently sitting her down. The emotion still ran through too high for her to form words. Apple Bloom's question was almost audible on her face. Why? Oh. Apple Bloom took a deep breath before helping her to her feet and gently sitting her down. The emotion still ran through, but Apple Bloom had somehow found them. Still ran too high before words. Apple Bloom had somehow found them. Stay here with Scootaloo. I'm gonna go get my sister. Stay here, just in case. In case she. No, she couldn't lie to her only remaining friend. She couldn't paint a pretty picture with Scooby's blood to make it all better. She took a step back and then turned and ran, yelling back, "Stay here!" Sweetie Belle didn't need to be told that now. Not once or twice more. Turned back to look down at Scooby and lay down beside her, trying to warm her with the heat from her body. Hush now, quiet now. It's time to lay your sleepy head. She softly sang before breaking into tears anew. And all the while Scooby hid her face in the mayor's chest, unable to stand, as her body convulsed with sobs. Far off, she could still hear Apple Bloom calling for help. She could still hear Sweetie Belle trying to wake her. Only then did she know that they could not, for she could never wake up again.